Zuko had never really thought about what it'd be like traveling with the Avatar, a near mythical being known to wield immense power and to be the caretaker of balance. Even the worst bout of cave boredom had never came close to presenting this concept to his mind. However, if he had ever thought about it, he wouldn't have pictured this. He warily stood, staying several feet apart from the group of three as they sightsaw. As they stared at some kind of canyon that was apparently impressive because it was big, Zuko didn't know. Maybe it would have impressed him at some point. With a monument this large, there was probably legends and plays about it that would have once wholly captured his mind. But he had his fill of staring at rock walls. He didn't dare mention it, though he allowed the others their fill of the view that the Great Divide offered. In fact, he didn't say anything. Katara and Sokka had been fighting the whole night yesterday, and even if the words had been about the tent and the firewood, he knew they were actually arguing about him. Katara's, how could you even think about sleeping in the same tent as the tarp? Tarp shouldn't be in the tent, Sokka. Hadn't exactly been subtle. Sokka's reply of, because I know this tarp, Katara, I trust it. You just have to trust me, had been less so. Zuko had used the argument to sullenly start a fire with the kindling that Katara had gathered. Even after days of relishing in the sun, his chi was weak, and he couldn't make flames, but he knew fire well enough to get a decent one started from the twigs that the waterbender had found. Okay, so he mostly avoided it because he knew that the instant he got near, he would start yelling, and well, he didn't want to be frozen to a tree, so he stepped back and bit his tongue. For now. He knew himself well enough to know he wasn't going to hold back for long. If he was, then he wouldn't be here. Sokka had showed up with more firewood a few moments later, so maybe they had actually been fighting about the chores? But then he made sure to sit next to Zuko at dinner, so maybe not. Zuko did not get these kids. Regardless, the score still stood with Sokka, and Aang for some reason, seeming to trust him, while Katara glared if he so much as sneezed. So he wasn't going to complain that Aang took them a day out of their way just to look at rocks. Luckily, Sokka, who was trusted by all members of the group, was similarly unimpressed. Okay, I've seen enough. How can you not be fascinated, Sokka? Katara asked. This is the largest canyon in the entire world. Even Zuko thinks it's neat. Aang cut in, and Zuko coughed awkwardly. Right, pretty rocks. Aang grinned at him as though he'd shown as much enthusiasm as Katara had, but the girl just glared. Sokka easily diverted all attention back to him, as he was quickly growing skilled at. Well, I'm sure we'll be able to see it very clearly from the air while we're flying away. He responded as he wrestled with Appa's reins. Suddenly, a man came running out of nowhere, yelling about how he had been there first and called dibs on the cavern guide for him and his tribe. Sokka tried to talk the man down as a village worth of people made their way to the cliff. Of course, the tribe at the man's heels wasn't his tribe. It was apparently some sort of blood feud tribe. Zuko was growing more and more worried that they would actually have to walk the canyon. The worry on increased when the first guy's tribe showed up just in time to catch the guide. It increased more when Katara suggested Aang try out his peacemaking skills to solve the dispute between the two parties, who seemed to hate each other for what appeared to be extremely stupid reasons. When Katara stepped forward to make everyone pay attention to Aang's ruling, he had pretty much completely given up on the idea of peacefully riding over on their convenient flying bison, because that's how his life was. There was a moment of minor chaos as the two people groups tried to determine who exactly would get to ride instead of walking, and Zuko took a moment to observe the two groups. The Gaijin were stately-seeming people, just as polished and well-groomed as Aang's insults implied, though Zuko wasn't sure why that was supposed to be an insult. Likewise, the Aang were much rougher. Their clothes were leather and fur, handmade. They were likely a hunting village, while the Gonpen were probably working in the trade. Still, the Aang weren't quite as sloven as the other group implied. Their gear seemed well cared for, especially their weapons. They had awesome weapons, including... Were those? He walked up to a man whose pack was laden with dozens of different swords, daggers, and projectile weapons. A smith, perhaps, bringing what he could of his livelihood on his journey. His livelihood apparently included the dowd. The man smiled, the open and expressive smile of a Zang rather than the sharp smirk of a merchant. "Are you looking to lighten my load for the journey?" Zuko grimaced, reality catching up to the overwhelming wave of want he felt the instant he saw the blades. "I wish," he replied honestly. "I don't exactly have anything. I don't have anything," he finished, his voice hollow and spent as he realized that he literally had nothing but the clothes on his back and the half chain still held fast around his wrist. The man frowned, but the woman next to him leaned forward. Ah, there was the merchant's smirk. "How about you do a little community service for it instead?" Sokka was not reassured that Aang also knew that he had no clue what he was doing. Meddling with the lives of two whole feuding villages could cause more problems than it would solve, especially since it seemed they didn't even want to pretend to play nice. Speaking of people not wanting to play nice, Katara was still talking with Aang, but where was Zuko? The Water Tribe team spotted him right away. The not-quite firebender was walking between the two groups of people, face etched in a particularly intense scowl. Sokka was starting to categorize a mental scale for Zuko's scowls. His default was around a 3. This was maybe a 7? 9 was reserved for whenever he was in the same room with Jet. Sokka feared that if he ever hit a 10, the firebender would just explode or something. He was still pondering what exactly would be needed to tip the boy into a 10 when Zuko's legs suddenly flew out from under him, sending the team sprawling into a huge puddle of mud. He fell heavily and awkwardly as he fell, sending clumps of mud flying through the air. Sokka was abruptly reminded that it had been less than a week since Zuko had gotten out of the cave. His hair was fuzzily starting to grow back from where they had shaved it, but who knew how the imprisonment affected his muscles? Sokka ran forward when Zuko was unsteadily rising to his feet. Ignored the gunmen, who were yelling in outrage at the mud stains now littering their pure white clothes. "Hey man, you okay?" "Huh?" the older teen asked, seemingly shockingly shocked by the question. "Oh yeah, I'm fine." He walked toward the Zang, all of whom were laughing uproariously and pointing at the muddied Gaipen. He made a beeline directly to a man with a backpack. Holy moose cow, that was a lot of weapons. The man and the woman beside him were laughing even harder than the rest. Without a word passing between them, the woman handed Zuko a gorgeous curved sword. The team was still scowl level 8, but as soon as he had the swords in his hand, the sour expression fell, replaced by a small smile. Sokka stopped, hard. His mind was slowly computing what had just happened. The Water Tribe boy could almost see math floating in front of his eyes. Zuko, who could walk through a forest and fall silently, had just had a loud and showy fall that had covered the Gaipen in a ton of mud. Then he received swords from the Zang. Wait, was that a fake fall? Of course it was. Zuko snapped as he fastened the holster over his shoulders. Do you think I would trip out over a stupid patch of dirt? Sokka, who had slipped on many patches of mud and ice, was quick to reply, "It could happen, Suddenly he had an epiphany. The epiphany was that free weapons in exchange for pranks were pretty much the best bargaining system ever. He wanted to volunteer, but before he could, Mr. Canyon Guide Bender Dude made the announcement that no food was allowed in the cavern. Now, in Sokka's life, few things were more important than weapons and pranks. Food was one of those things. By the time he was finishing up the last of his seal jerky he smuggled from home, the first few travelers were starting to head down the path. Aang and Katara walked through first, hanging close to the guide, but Zuko was lingering back. You okay, man? Zuko nodded, yes, in a sharp, jerky way that actually meant no. Sokka frowned, confused at first, but didn't take long to equate that gorgeous stone walls to consistently gave, to see how Zuko was fiddling with the metal still locked around his wrist. Sokka inhaled sharply and quickly tried to divert attention away from the gentle sloping stone path. So, new sword? That's neat. Zuko pulled them out. innately holding it as a two-handed blade before separating his arms with a smooth motion, revealing twin weapons. Thou dual Dao, my sword-fighting master told me that the way of the sword belonged to all nations. These are almost identical to the ones you can find in the Fire Nation. Grip's a little different, but I've also grown a lot since I last used them, so it could just be that. Sokka gaped. Wait, that's 2 swords? That's awesome! That's why you were using 2 rods in the cave. Dude, we should totally spar. No, Zuko said immediately, and Sokka had the sudden and intense desire to slam his head against a rock, repeatedly. Hey, your friend is having an adverse reaction to trauma. Why don't you directly mention that trauma and ask him to recreate a major part of it? That would be a good plan, right? Why did they let him be the plan guy? Why couldn't it just be the... Fighting with you could barely be called sparring, the firebender continued, heedless of Sokka's internal struggle. I can teach you to fight if you want, but I will not be subjected to your flailing. Hey, I got a few good hits in last time, Zuko snorted. A few hits. You didn't win a single bout and we did over a dozen. Rude. That's just because you couldn't convince me to use my boomerang. If you could see my skills with that, you would be grateful I spared your sorry butt. Zuko snorted again, dismissively, which, double rude. See if Sokka felt bad about bringing up his trauma next time. Okay, he would definitely still feel bad about it, but still. The firebender was about to eat his words. I'll show you. He scanned the chasm, eyes quickly darting around until he found a cluster of closely packed mini plateaus. Yeah, there. He grabbed Zuko's shoulder and pointed to the cluster. I see rocks, the firebender, without fire, said, sounding unimpressed. Exactly. Sokka pulled a boomerang out of its sheath and leveled it with the rocks, pointing. Some of the trailing Zhang paused as well, watching with interest. I'm going to throw it between those 2 plateaus. Then it's going to weave around that one and that one, go through the gap there, and come back to my hand. What? Sokka, don't be an idiot. You'll lose that thing here, and you're never going to get it back. The Water Tribe team rolled his eyes. I'm not going to miss. Watch. He squinted. And duck. Sokka, no. Sokka, yes. The non-bender watched with a smug smirk. As his boomerang left his hand in a familiar swing, the weight and shape as comfortable to him as his own hand. A broad grin split his face as he watched the weapon follow the exact path he predicted. Zuko ducked the instant before the weapon would make contact, and Sokka caught it smoothly, smirk never faltering. Zuko watched him considerately for a moment. Then, I'm glad I couldn't convince you to use your boomerang in the cave. Sokka burst out a laugh at that. From the way that Zuko jumped in surprise at the sound, it was obvious that it was one of Zuko's not really jokes, but earnest statements that are really funny jokes that are quickly becoming the best jokes. Usually much better than his actual joke attempts. Sokka was pretty sure Aang agreed, because he always laughed even harder when he realized that Zuko hadn't been trying. The elder teen gave a hint of a not-quite smile and asked, How can you be so good with that, and so bad with your club? I'm not that bad, Sokka said with a frown. Zuko snorted. I'm pretty sure I could disarm you with literally nothing. In fact, I did. Remember that kick the first time you came at me? Sokka groaned. He swore he could still hear the sound of his club clattering to the grave floor. Zuko shifted guiltily. You aren't bad. You're smart. You have a lot of potential. Great. Now can you say that like you aren't being actively tortured? I mean it, Zuko said, sounding affronted. Sokka personally thought that he was the one who should be affronted in the exchange, but... If you could fight as well as you can throw that thing, you could actually be a challenge, he said as though he was defending himself instead of Sokka somehow. Sokka honestly wasn't sure if he should feel insulted or complimented at this point, but Zuko was no longer panicking, and that was a good thing. So he did what he did best and just talked. He talked about how his father had left when he was younger than Aang, and the boomerang was the only thing he could practice by himself. He talked about how his training had been more about using his weapons to hunt and provide for the tribe than melee with other people. He talked about how he barely been trained but had tried his hardest to turn the children of his tribe into warriors. He discussed weapon making and sparring dummies and endless requests for body breaks. Zuko in turn offered stories of his own. He talked about calligraphy and rock gardening and a father who disapproved of non-bending weapons, but a love and skill that made it impossible to put down the blades. He spoke of a master who had pushed him, but was patient and kind. The near Zhang offered stories of their own, and in no time Zuko was as relaxed as he ever got, which was still about 5 times more tense than Sokka at his most stressed, but still. Then everything changed when some loose rocks attacked. The earthbender easily deflected them with some weak joke about sacrifices to the gods, but the damage was done and Zuko was back to looking like a single wrong word would make him explode. Sokka sighed and lowered his voice. Sorry, man, we didn't think. I should have realized. No. These people needed help. Those sick and elderly might not have made it without Appa, and they might have wasted the day fighting if Aang hadn't. These refugees lost everything, and they needed someone. Us? They needed us. It's good that we helped. To ignore people in need would be dishonorable. It wouldn't be right. He said the words firmly, as though it could make it more convincing when his hands hadn't left his sword hilt. His eyes were constantly darting around all the cavern walls, and his breathing was irregular. Sokka wished for a moment the Katara had gotten used to the concept of a trustworthy firebender, or that Aang wasn't spending all his time chatting with the earthbender guide. Emotional support was not Sokka's area of expertise. He was the plan guy, not the feelings guy. Still, he was the only one there, so he tried. Just because these guys need help, and we want to help them, doesn't mean we can't help you too. We're your friends, Zuko. If you had told us, we would have figured something out. Zuko took in a deep, shuddering breath that he let out through clenched teeth. I can handle it, he said sharply, then started walking forward to catch up to the others in the front of the line. He then proceeded to ignore any further attempts to talk about it, barely doing more than looking in front of his feet as they made their way down deeper and deeper into the rocks. He said nothing as the guide had them stop at the floor of the canyon so that he could break up the bridge they had used to climb down, though he grew only tenser as he watched his only sure exit be destroyed. Amazingly, he only lost his tension when some kind of nope monster came out of the dust cloud that the bending had kicked up and grasped the earthbender in its monstrous maw. Sokka and Zuko had moved as one, Zuko darting forward while Sokka threw his boomerang, the boomerang nailing the monster in the face, enraging it and sending it rampaging toward Sokka. Unfortunately for the monster, that took it right past Zuko, who swept out with his swords to lob several feet off one of the beast's spindly legs. The beast turned attention to Zuko then, who met its evil red gaze with crossed blades and burning golden glare. Katara attacked with Water Whip to turn the beast's attention away, but it did nothing but make it angrier. Even Zuko's darting attack to the monster's other side seemed to barely affect it. Only when Aang created an actual literal sideways tornado did the monster scurry away, seeming almost entirely unharmed. Sokka went to retrieve his boomerang, only truly relaxing when the familiar weapon was in his hand. Zuko was still watching the spot where the creature had disappeared, but both of the teams froze when they heard Aang's chilling words. We're trapped in this canyon. Zuko dropped his swords, the metal clanging emptily against the dusty stone ground of the canyon. Predictably, the two tribes almost immediately started to argue as Katara tended to the wounds of the guide, but Sokka was watching Zuko carefully. The team was clenching and unclenching his fist, standing protectively over his swords as his chest visibly heaved, and he shook his head. Zuko pulled at the chain on his wrist. Each gasping breath came out as a growl. Sokka took a hesitative step forward. Hey, it's gonna... Don't touch me! Zuko growled, standing his ground as his golden eyes glared at the water team. Zuko, you know I'm serious, Sokka. Don't test me! At that moment, Sokka realized that there were no anger in that glare, only a deepest fear. Sokka considered the situation carefully and stepped back. He forced himself to think, not react. If there was anything that Sokka knew about Zuko, it was that he didn't give up. He was a fighter, first and foremost. Here, threatened and triggered and trapped, his more feral instincts would be rising. The only problem was, there was nothing for him to fight. No enemy. If Sokka made himself the threat, he wouldn't like the results. Okay, Zuko, I'm stepping back, okay? You need to breathe. Feel the sun? That's the thing, right? You firebenders like the sun a lot. So just feel it. You aren't in the cave, Jet isn't here. You have options. At this point, Katara had noticed them. I was looking at Zuko with more worry than fear for the first time since the firebender first appeared. Zuko had whirled to face the sun, and his breathing was evening out somewhat. So Sokka kept going. You can always climb out of the cave or Aang can fly to find Appa. We're okay. As if in response to his words, Aang chose that moment to send a rush of fierce air through the canyon, easily flying to the top of a plateau as he commanded the warring groups to separate. He made it seem as easy as blinking, and Sokka thought it was that more than anything that had Zuko relaxing enough to grab and sheath his weapons. Zuko had a way out. He wasn't trapped like that. Not again. He walked beside Katara and Sokka as they met Aang at the base of the plateau, but Sokka could see the tension in his steps. He was calmer, but the fear and anger were barely kept at bay. Aang commanded the Water Tribe teens to split among the group, but when he came to Zuko, he paused. Luckily, the Fire Nation teen was quick to cut in. I'm staying with you. Even from up there, you won't be able to keep an eye on everyone at once. Aang slumped, as though relieved. Oh, good. I thought I would have to do that all alone. That would have been so boring. Sokka rolled his eyes, but he couldn't help but smile as Zuko began climbing the plateau, stubbornly refusing Aang's help. At least he got the cool people. Katara was stuck with a gun pen. Zuko didn't feel like he was actually breathing until after he clawed his way, by himself, to the top of the plateau that bisected the canyon. He made it out on his own merit. He did it. He wasn't trapped again. Wouldn't let himself be trapped again. Aang, who had made the same trip in less than 5 seconds, clapped excitedly as the firebender pulled himself to his feet. That was so cool. I don't think I could have done that without my airbending. Thanks, the team replied, still uncertain in light of the other boy's kindness. The boy's expression dropped a moment later, and somehow that was worse. I don't know what to do about this. I'm the Avatar. I'm supposed to be in balance in conflicts. How am I supposed to save the world if I can't even get 2 tribes to get along? The Avatar floated over the floor with a groan. Any ideas? Zuko hesitated, then said honestly, Aang, if I was any good at conflict resolution, I wouldn't have spent 3 years locked in a cave. I wouldn't have been banished in the first place. Okay, that's fair. The boy sighed and propped his chin on his hand as he watched the 2 tribes set up vastly different camps. Zuko hesitated and moved to sit cross-legged beside the slumped airbender. This doesn't mean we can't try, though. You know, brainstorm? That's a great idea! Okay, how do we start? Okay, when you're in an argument with someone, what usually makes you stop fighting? The airbender frowned, looking contemplative for a moment before confessing, I don't know. The monk said that forgiveness is powerful, both when giving and receiving. We were taught to solve problems without fighting. The last time I was really upset about something, it didn't end well. His last words were nearly whispered, though a million different emotions hung on every syllable. Notes of shame, regret, and sadness. Zuko was asked, but he looked in the tension of the boy's shoulders, the way his face was closed off. There was a box that shouldn't be prodded. Not yet. Well, I fought with my sister a lot, or she fought with me. We fought each other. What made you stop? Zuko had to think. It felt like a lifetime ago. Sometimes my father would come in and say that my sister was right, and I should stop embarrassing myself. Or Mom would come in and say it doesn't matter who was right, we need to get along because we're siblings. Well, I don't think they're going to get along because I said so, but maybe if Katara and Sokka can figure out what happened, I can tell them who's right. Zuko considered that for a moment and shook his head. No, I was always mad after that, and we would usually get in the same exact fight a few days later. Father was never happy to find him making a fool of himself over the exact same argument, but it never stopped him from making the same mistake again and again. The pair were silent for a moment. Zuko tried to think about if anything would actually work to end a fight with his sister, beyond Azula shooting him with blue fire. He didn't think Aang would appreciate that suggestion. After a moment, he sighed heavily. The only thing I can remember ending a fight, not leaving mad, was when Uncle caught us. He always was arguing about the stupidest things around him. Once I remember being mad because she burned my favorite theater scroll, and he was all... He affected an accent. I see you are fighting due to a heartbreak of a lost possession, but one must remember the flower both loses and receives pollen in due time, and it was this which allows it to grow. And it'll be like, no heartbreak, it was just a scroll. It's not the big of a deal. He always caught us when it was something stupid like that. He missed Uncle. Aang, however, was leaning forward excitedly. That's it! Zuko frowned, trying to remember saying anything useful. What's it? I just had to figure out why they're fighting and make it seem like that was the stupidest thing ever. Take whatever they're mad about and make it so that it's so ridiculous that you might be embarrassed to even mention that they thought about it. Forget about actually feuding anymore. Zuko blinked slowly. That might actually work. Aang straightened, his eyes gleaming as they shared grins in the dark. A few moments later, Zuko frowned. Wait, is that what Uncle had been doing the whole time? The next morning, Zuko acted as pseudo-crutch for the guide at the front of the group, watching as Aang tried to ask Katara and Sokka about why the people were fighting. Based on the gesturing, it wasn't going well. Zuko was kind of rethinking tabling the yell at them and tell them their wrong idea. Even if he didn't know what they were fighting about, Zuko may not be great at talking, but he was really good at yelling. Aang was getting better at it, though. He acknowledged as the boy once more called for the feuding tribes to stop fighting. Maybe they didn't have to get these people to get along. If they could just find a way out of this stupid almost a cave. Then, of course, Aang had to say the stupidest thing ever. Harsh words won't solve our problems. Action will. Aang somehow seemed to forget that fighting was an action. Zuko watched with detached interest as the two leaders clashed swords. He was starting to rethink the whole, it was right to help these people thing, he said to Sokka way back then. Was that really just yesterday? It felt like they were taking forever to get out of this canyon. Maybe he was just grumpy because he was hungry. No, he was always this grumpy. The fight was intense, well-matched and ferocious, with the leaders' people shouting and cheering in the background. Both were skilled with their weapons and unwilling to give any ground. However, neither could withstand the might of the Avatar. With a single swing of his staff, Aang created a tidal wave of air that sent the two groups rocketing back and sending their supplies flying. The growl of Zuko's stomach met a growl of anger as food flew from the packs. No, he was definitely grumpy because he was hungry, and those fools were about to feel his wrath. You had food? He snarled. We were trapped in here. Aang and I are starving, and you couldn't go without a snack for one day on pain of death? He jabbed a finger at the guide. This man's wounds, the harm to his livelihood, the lives of every single group of refugees he can't bring through because he can't bend. These are all on your head, you pig-headed, selfish, miserable, greedy peasants. You're all awful. Aang's voice joined before he whimpered at the sight of a pie. Zuko had just gotten started, though, and was taking in a deep breath to continue when the crevice was suddenly filled with the echoing growls of the canyon crawlers. Zuko grabbed his Dougal, jumping into the fray as the monsters flooded their canyon. He slashed and sliced and stabbed. Every move he made was calculated, exacting, and purposeful. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. There were too many crawlers. They were too big. Their exoskeletons were too strong. Then Aang turned the attacking creatures into some sort of odd mount to use to climb the cliff. Because that was apparently a thing. Somehow. Honestly, Zuko didn't really care. He was out of the canyon. That was all that really mattered. He jumped on the beast immediately, lest it carry him back into the pit, and stood between Sokka and Katara. They seemed to be getting along better. So did the feuding tribes, which was good, because if anyone started fighting again, he would bring out his swords. He no longer cared about the consequences. He was done. Suddenly, the two leaders had their swords at each other's throats. Zuko growled and went for his own blades. He was going to stop this feud, right here, right now. Sokka put a hand over his, shaking his head with startled eyes, when suddenly Aang's voice rang out. Wait, I know those guys! He glanced back at Zuko and winked. The firebender squinted, uncertain at first, before remembering their plan on the plateau. Okay, he would let Aang try. If this doesn't work, though, he didn't sheath his swords. The teen listened as Aang wove a tale that turned the theft of a sacred relic to the story of a pair of children playing a ball game, and struggled to keep from rolling his eyes. Most because they were buying it, hook, line, and sinker. Normally, Zuko would prefer an honorable fight to a deception of this level, but these people were quickly making him too angry to care, so he just did what he could to school his face into a blank expression. The tribesmen had questions, of course, but Aang somehow answered with incredibly ridiculous excuses, and they were buying it. How come no one ever believed his lies like this? Somehow, no one caught on, and in what felt like moments, one tribe maybe, were walking away together. Sokka grinned at Aang. That's some luck you knew Guy Wan and Wan Gen. Zuko growled loudly. Don't tell me you fell for it too. Aang, I know we said to make it seem ridiculous, but really? A game of redemption, 8 years old, the penalty box? Aang grinned at him cheekily, and the warrior tribe teens gaped as they caught on. Wait, are you saying you made that all up? That is so wrong. Katara grinned wickedly, eyes bright. Zuko rolled his eyes. Of course he made it up. You guys don't really think he's 112 years old, do you? Silence filling the clearing, then Aang said tentatively, Well, actually... Zuko groaned. You know what? No, I'm too hungry to deal with this. Oh, me too. Did anyone see where that custard pie went?